The world had been at war for so long that people had forgotten what peace felt like. Smoke had become the color of the sky, and silence was a thing no one remembered anymore. Cities had turned into skeletons of steel and dust. Families lived. In bunkers, children grew up without knowing laughter, and the few who still had hope carried it like a fragile flame that could die at any moment. In the middle of this endless darkness stood Commander Ethan Vale, a man whose heart still carried that small flame. He was a soldier, but more than that, he was a leader who never stopped believing that humanity could still rise again. He was known by his men as the Human Warship, not because of machines or weapons, but because of his strength, his will, and the fire that lived inside him. Ethan had fought for many years. He had seen friends fall beside him, seen whole towns vanish overnight, and watched the light fade from the eyes of those who had once believed victory was possible. But he never gave up. He kept standing, kept leading, and kept fighting. People followed him because when he spoke, they felt courage returning to their hearts. His voice was calm but strong, and when he said they would survive, they believed him. Now, as the last resistance gathered in a hidden valley far from the enemy's main base, Ethan stood before them once again. The soldiers were tired, their faces thin, uniforms torn and patched many times, but their eyes were fixed on him. The air was cold, and the sound of the wind passing through broken metal reminded them that this might be their last night before the final battle. Ethan walked among them slowly, looking at each face. These were not just soldiers anymore. They were the last defenders of the human race. There were young boys who had never seen peace, old men who had returned to fight one last time, and women who had left their homes to protect the future. They all waited for him to speak. When he stopped in the center of the camp, the fires flickered around him, and the only sound left was the quiet crackle of burning wood. He began to speak in a steady tone that carried through the cold air. He told them that the next dawn would be their final stand, that the world would remember this day forever. He said that they were not fighting for power or land, but for life itself. He told them that every breath they took tomorrow would decide the future of mankind. His words were simple, but they reached deep into the hearts of everyone listening. Some soldiers wiped tears from their faces without shame. Others clenched their fists and nodded. When he finished, the silence that followed was not from fear, but from unity. Every person in that valley felt the same thing. They were ready to fight, ready to die, and ready to make sure humanity would not disappear. Ethan looked up at the night sky and saw no stars, only clouds of smoke and fire. But he imagined them there anyway. He whispered a quiet promise to himself that he would not let the light fade forever. That night he could not sleep. He walked along the edge of the camp, watching his soldiers rest. Some dreamed in silence, others whispered prayers or wrote messages they hoped someone might one day read. He stopped near a small tent where a young soldier sat cleaning his weapon. The boy's hands trembled. Ethan knelt beside him and asked if he was afraid. The boy nodded without speaking. Ethan smiled and told him that fear was not a weakness. He said that only fools felt nothing before battle, but brave men felt fear and still moved forward. The boy looked at him with wide eyes and asked if they could really win. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that they had already won by standing here, by refusing to give up when the world wanted them to vanish. The boy smiled weakly and whispered, "Then I will stand with you." Ethan nodded and walked away. As the first light of morning touched the valley, the resistance began to prepare. Weapons were checked, armor tightened, and the last remaining vehicles were fueled. Ethan stood at the front, watching the horizon where the enemy lines stretched beyond sight. The machines of war waited there like a sea of steel. Drones hovered above, and enormous cannons moved slowly into position. The enemy had everything: numbers, technology, and power. Humanity had almost nothing left, but they had something no machine could ever understand: the will to fight for their own kind. Ethan raised his hand, and every soldier grew silent. He looked at them one last time and said only a few words. He told them that this was the day the world would remember, the day when humans would stand together and remind the universe that their spirit could never be broken. When he gave the signal, the army moved forward through the smoke. The ground shook with every step. The enemy began to fire, and explosions lit the sky, but still the resistance kept advancing. Ethan led from the front, never hiding behind his men. Bullets flew past him, and fire burned around him, but he kept walking, shouting orders, pulling the wounded to safety, and never once slowing down. Hours passed and the battlefield became chaos. Yet somehow, through the noise and destruction, Ethan's voice kept reaching his soldiers. He shouted for them to keep going, to hold the line, to push forward no matter what. His calmness made them fearless. When they saw him charge through enemy lines alone, they followed. Every time he raised his weapon, it felt like the strength of 1,000 men was behind him. The enemy began to hesitate, unsure how a small band of humans could stand against such power. By nightfall, the resistance had pushed deeper than anyone thought possible. They had taken heavy losses, but they were still standing. Ethan stood on a small hill, his uniform torn and covered in dust. Around him, fires burned and the cries of battle echoed, but he felt something in the air, a shift. He looked across the field and saw the enemy regrouping, their machines moving slower now, their lines broken in places. Hope sparked again inside him. He turned to his soldiers and raised his arm, shouting for one final push. They responded with a roar that drowned out the sound of explosions. When darkness finally covered the battlefield, the fighting slowed. The survivors of the resistance gathered again near the ruined vehicles. Ethan walked among them, helping carry the wounded, comforting those who had lost friends, and promising that their sacrifices were not in vain. He looked toward the distant horizon where the enemy still waited, knowing that the war was far from over, but something had changed this day. The human warship had risen, and humanity had seen what courage truly meant. As the cold night settled, again Ethan stood alone for a moment, listening to the wind passing through the broken ground. He felt pain, exhaustion, and loss, but above all he felt pride. The people had fought as one. For the first time in many years, he believed that victory was not just a dream. The fire inside him burned brighter than ever, and he knew that as long as even one human heart still carried that light, the world would never fall completely into darkness. The sun rose weakly through the smoke that hung over the broken valley where the battle had begun the day before, and the light seemed tired, like the world itself. Ethan Vale stood at the front line, his uniform torn and covered in dust. His eyes, red from sleepless hours, and yet there was still strength in his face. He looked at the land ahead, the scorched earth filled with craters and the fallen remains of machines that had once seemed unstoppable. The enemy had pulled back, but he knew it was only to prepare for another strike. The resistance had survived the first wave, but they had lost many good people, and the pain of their absence rested heavy on everyone's hearts. Still, no one spoke of defeat. Ethan would not allow it. His calm voice and his steady walk kept them from breaking. He moved through the camp, slowly stopping beside soldiers who were cleaning weapons or tending to wounds. He did not shout orders this morning. He spoke softly to each person, reminding them that they had done something impossible the night before. They had held the line against the strongest army in the world. He told them that every breath they took was proof that humanity could still fight, and as he spoke, men and women began to lift their heads again, their eyes turning toward him with trust and pride. In that moment, they were no longer just survivors. They were warriors following the one man who still believed victory was possible. By noon, Ethan called his officers to gather around a small map spread over a piece of broken metal. The enemy camp was close, only a few miles north beyond the ridge of the valley. They had machines stronger than anything the resistance had ever seen. But Ethan saw something the others did. He saw weakness in their pattern of movement. He pointed at the map and explained that the enemy relied on their central command towers. Without them, their machines became confused, slow, and blind. He said that if they could take out the command base, the whole army would fall into disorder. One of the younger officers argued that it was suicide, but Ethan shook his head. He said that no battle was won without someone daring to do what others feared. He would lead the strike himself. When the sun began to sink again, the resistance prepared for the attack. They moved quietly through the narrow paths between the hills, carrying what little ammunition they had left. There were no armored vehicles, no air support, only faith and determination. Ethan walked in front, His steps steady, his eyes scanning every shadow around him. He had memorized the landscape, every stone and every curve of the ground. He moved like a man who belonged there, and the soldiers followed his lead, trusting that somehow he would find a way. As darkness covered the valley, the enemy lights appeared in the distance, glowing like cold stars. Machines moved in lines across the flat land, their metal bodies reflecting the red glare of explosions far away. Ethan raised his hand and everyone dropped to the ground in silence. He watched the patrols move by, counting the seconds between each pass. Then he whispered the plan. Half the group would circle around and cut the enemy's supply route. The rest would follow him straight through the center. Their goal was the command core, a tall structure of metal and glass guarded by drones and automated cannons. It was suicide to even try, but no one hesitated. The first explosion came from the south, where the diversion team hit the supply. Convoy smoke rose and alarms began to sound. The enemy forces turned toward the noise just as Ethan's team charged from the shadows. They moved fast, firing as they ran. Shouts filled the night. The air turned thick with dust and smoke. Ethan's rifle fired until it was empty. Then he grabbed another from a fallen soldier and kept going. Bullets tore through the ground near his feet, but he did not stop. He was the first to reach the gate. He threw a grenade at the tower's defense unit, and the blast shook the ground open. Fire rained down from above, but his soldiers poured in behind him like a storm. Inside the base, the walls glowed red from emergency lights. Ethan moved through corridors filled with smoke machines fired blindly, but the humans were faster. They moved like shadows, silent and deadly. Each step brought them closer to the command core. When they reached the main chamber, the sight stopped everyone for a second. The core stood like a giant column of blue light, humming with power. This was the brain of the enemy army. Destroying it would mean ending the war in this region. Ethan turned to his team and told them to hold the entrance. While he moved forward, he placed the last explosive charge on the base of the core and set the timer as the sound of footsteps and gunfire echoed closer. He looked back once at his men and shouted for them to run. The explosion ripped through the base, shaking the ground for miles around. The light burst into the sky, and then everything went dark for a few seconds. No one could see or hear anything. Then slowly the sounds returned. The machines outside began to shut down one by one. Their lights flickered and died. The battlefield went strangely quiet. The soldiers, who were still standing, looked around in disbelief. The machines were no longer moving. The drones fell from the sky like dead birds. The human warship had done what no weapon could do. He had broken the enemy from the inside. Ethan crawled out of the wreckage, blood running down his arm, his head ringing from the blast. But when he saw the silent field around him, he felt a strange peace for the first time in years. He stood on unshaken ground. He looked back and saw his soldiers cheering through their tears. They were alive. They had won the impossible fight, and for a moment he let himself smile. When they returned to camp that night, the survivors gathered around a small fire. No one spoke for a long time. They just sat there listening to the quiet that had followed the battle. Some wept silently. Others stared into the flames, trying to believe what had just happened. Ethan sat among them, his body tired, but his spirit awake. He thought of those who had fallen, of the young soldier who had promised to stand with him, and he whispered a silent promise that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. Later that night, a messenger from the other human outposts arrived, bringing news that the destruction of the enemy's command tower had caused a chain reaction across the region. Enemy units were retreating, abandoning their strongholds. Humans were regaining ground. Ethan listened in silence, then stood up and looked at the faces of his people. He told them that this was not the end, but the beginning. The world had started to change because they had believed when no one else did. As dawn broke again, the valley looked different. The air still smelled of smoke and death. But beneath it, there was something new, a faint sense of hope. The soldiers began to rebuild their defenses and tend to the wounded. Ethan climbed a small ridge and watched the sun rise over the land that had seen so much pain. He could feel the weight of every life lost and every step still ahead, but deep inside he knew they had crossed a line that could never be undone. Humanity had found its strength again. They had faced the storm and still stood tall. He knew more battles were coming, but he also knew that no machine, no army, and No darkness could ever destroy the will of mankind while even one heart still burned with courage. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and whispered that they were not done yet. The human warship would fight until the world was free. Again, the days after the attack were filled with silence broken only by the wind moving through the burnt fields and the soft sound of tools as the soldiers repaired what little equipment they had left the valley that had been filled with death. And Smoke was now a place of rest and waiting. The enemy had fallen back for the first time in years, and the world had begun to whisper again that maybe the war could be won. Commander Ethan Vale stood at the edge of the camp every morning watching the horizon with sharp eyes. He knew this calm would not last long. He could feel it deep in his chest that something darker was coming. The enemy had lost one battle, but they would return stronger and more determined. He could not let his people fall into comfort. He had to prepare them for what was next. The soldiers worked without complaint, though their faces showed how tired they were. Ethan moved among them, helping wherever he could, carrying crates, repairing weapons, even cooking with the younger ones when the food supplies were low. He was not a commander who watched from a distance. He lived among them, sharing their hunger, their pain, and their hope. They called him the human warship because it felt like his spirit could carry them all. When they looked at him, they saw not just a leader but a shield between them and the endless storm. He never told them how much the weight of that trust pressed on his shoulders every night. When he finally closed his eyes, he dreamed of faces he could not save, and the screams of those who had fallen in the last battle. But each morning he woke with the same calm determination, because he knew there was no other choice. As the resistance rebuilt its strength, messages began to arrive. From other human groups across the land, they had heard of Ethan Vale and the destruction of the enemy command tower. His name spread through the broken cities like a spark. People started calling him the man who fought like 1,000 soldiers, the one who turned fear into fire. Some said he was more machine than man. Others said he was a miracle. But Ethan ignored all the stories. He did not fight for glory. He fought so that the next generation would not have to live in fear. One evening, while he was studying maps inside a damaged tent, his second-in-command, Captain Mara Hale, entered. Her face was covered in dust, and her arm was bandaged, but her eyes were sharp. She told Ethan that the scouts had spotted enemy movements north of the river. A large force was gathering there with new machines stronger and faster than the ones before. Ethan listened quietly, his hands resting on the map. He asked how much time they had, and she said maybe 2 days before they would be surrounded. He nodded and for a long moment said nothing. Then he looked up and told her to prepare everyone. They would not run this time. They would stand their ground here in this valley and fight. That night the camp was filled with movement as soldiers prepared for battle again. Some repaired armor. Others built traps and reinforced the barricades. The air was heavy, but there was no panic. Only quiet focus. Ethan walked through the camp, stopping to talk to his men one by one. He told them that no matter what happened, they were already heroes. They had brought back hope to a dying world. He reminded them that fear was not the end. It was the beginning of courage. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. When he finished speaking, no one cheered. They simply nodded and went back to work, each of them ready to face whatever waited in the darkness beyond the hills. When dawn came, the sound of engines filled the air. The ground trembled as the enemy army appeared on the horizon. They were larger than before. Rows of machines rolling forward like waves of iron drones flew above, casting shadows that covered the land. Ethan stood on the front line watching them approach. Beside him stood Captain Mara and a handful of the oldest fighters who had been with him from the start. They had no fear left in their faces, only resolve. Ethan raised his hand and gave the signal, and the battle began. The first explosion hit near the barricades, throwing dust and fire into the air. Soldiers took cover and fired back. Bullets and energy blasts cut through the smoke. Ethan moved among them, shouting orders, his voice clear, even through the noise. When a group of young fighters froze in panic, he ran to them, grabbed one by the shoulder, and pointed forward, shouting that this was their home and no one would take it from them again. They rose and fired until their weapons overheated. The enemy machines advanced slowly, crushing everything in their path. But Ethan led a counterattack using the traps they had built the night before. Mines exploded under the machines' feet, and hidden tunnels allowed the resistance to strike from below. For hours the battle raged on, and the valley became a sea of fire. The sky turned black with smoke, and the air smelled of metal and ash. Ethan never stopped moving. He fought like a storm, his weapon blazing until it melted in his hands. Then he picked up another. He was everywhere at once, pulling wounded men to safety, throwing grenades with perfect aim, shouting commands that turned chaos into order. His soldiers said later that he looked almost unreal, that he moved like a shadow of war itself, unstoppable and calm even when the world was burning around him. But even the strongest heart can begin to break when the weight becomes too heavy. As the sun began to set, the resistance lines started to thin. Many had fallen, and the rest were running low on ammunition. Captain Mara was bleeding but refused to leave the field. She ran to Ethan, shouting that they were being surrounded. He looked around and saw it too. The enemy had cut off their retreat. He knew there was only one choice left, he told her. To gather the remaining soldiers near the central ridge, they would make their last stand. There he picked up a fallen flag from the ground and carried it himself as he walked toward the ridge. The soldiers followed behind him silently. They knew what this meant. The final attack came like thunder. The machines charged all at once, the ground shaking beneath them. Ethan stood at the front, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He shouted for his people to hold the line, and when the machines came within range, he ran forward alone, firing at their lead units. His soldiers watched in disbelief as he leapt onto the burning wreckage of a destroyed vehicle and kept firing from above the sight of him. There made something awaken in them, the tiredness, and fear vanished, and they surged forward together, screaming his name. The valley filled with the sound of human voices, louder than the explosions, louder than the machines. As the night fell again, the battlefield was covered in smoke and fire. Resistance had lost almost everything, but they were still standing. The enemy had pulled back, leaving hundreds of broken machines behind. Ethan stood among the wreckage, his uniform torn and his face streaked with dirt and blood. He could barely breathe, but he did not fall around him. The survivors began to gather slowly, one by one. They looked at him in silence. None of them spoke for a long time. Then someone began to whisper his name, the human warship, and soon they were all saying it, again and again, until the sound rolled through the valley like a wave. Ethan looked at them and felt the weight of what they had done. He knew many more battles were waiting beyond the horizon. But tonight they had done something greater than victory. They had proven that humanity could still rise no matter how many times it was pushed down. He lowered the flag gently into the ground and whispered that they would rebuild again tomorrow. He turned to the stars hidden behind smoke, and for the first time in many years he felt the faint warmth of hope. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the sound of the wind and the quiet breathing of his people fill the air around him. And he knew the fight was far from over, but as long as there was even one heartbeat left in this world, humanity would never surrender. The night after the great battle was cold and still. The fires had burned out, and the air was thick with the smell of metal and smoke. Bodies lay across the ground, both human and machine. The moon was hidden behind heavy clouds, and the valley was covered in a pale gray light. Commander Ethan Vale sat alone on a broken piece of steel, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The battle had ended. But his mind was far from rest. His soldiers were sleeping nearby, their faces marked with exhaustion and sorrow. They had survived, but the cost was unbearable. Too many had fallen. Too many names would never be spoken again. He felt their absence like stones pressing against his heart. Yet even in this silence he knew that the fight was not over. The enemy would not stop. They never did, and soon the world would call on him again. As the hours passed, he stood up and began to walk through the wreckage, his boots crunching against the shattered remains of machines. He stopped by a broken cannon and looked at his reflection in the twisted metal. His face was pale, his eyes tired but steady. He thought about what it meant to be called the human warship. It was never about power or pride. It was about endurance. It was about carrying the pain of many, so others could keep standing. He never asked to be a symbol, but now he was one, and he had to live up to it. He turned toward the camp and saw the first light of dawn creeping across the sky. The valley looked like a graveyard, yet somehow it also looked peaceful. The sound of morning wind moving through the burnt trees felt like a whisper of life. When the soldiers woke, they found Ethan already at work. He was helping the medics move the wounded and clearing the debris from the field. He gave orders, calmly organizing the recovery teams, and making sure everyone had food and water. His voice carried quiet strength that reminded them they were still alive. They started to move faster, working with purpose even though their bodies were weak by noon. The camp looked different again. The broken lines of defeat were replaced by the small signs of rebuilding. They had lost the battle's fire, but gained something deeper, a belief that as long as Ethan was there, they still had a chance. Later that day, a scout arrived, bringing news that the enemy forces had fallen into confusion. After their command units were destroyed, many of their machines had stopped responding and others had retreated. North Ethan listened carefully, then called his officers together around a flat stone where a new map had been spread. He pointed to the enemy's central base far beyond the mountains. It was where the main control core was located. He said that if they destroyed it, the war would finally turn in humanity's favor. One of the officers said that the journey would be impossible. They had no vehicles left, and the path was full of traps and patrols. Ethan looked at them and said nothing for a moment. Then he simply nodded and said that nothing was impossible for those who refused to die before victory. The next few days were a blur of movement and planning. The resistance packed what supplies they could carry and began to march through the ruins of old cities. They moved quietly at night, avoiding the enemy drones that still searched the skies every time one flew overhead. They hid under the remains of buildings, waiting until the red lights passed. Ethan walked at the front, leading them through narrow alleys and broken highways, his steps never slowing, even when his body ached with pain. He had been injured in the last battle, but he refused to show it. He could not let them see weakness. When they grew tired, he told stories of the old world, stories of children playing in parks and families gathering around warm homes. Many of them had never seen such things before, but they listened and smiled, and the thought of that world kept them walking. After a week of travel, they reached the edge of the mountain range where the enemy's main base was hidden beneath a field of black stone. The air there felt heavy and electric. The ground was covered with cables and metal roots that pulsed faintly with light. Ethan signaled for his people to rest behind the rocks and studied the landscape through his binoculars. The base was enormous, a maze of towers and energy lines guarded by hundreds of drones. There was no clear path but he noticed something: a narrow canyon leading under one of the smaller towers. If they could sneak through it, they might reach the central core. He explained the plan quietly, and no one argued. They trusted him completely, even though they knew many of them would not return. That night, under the cover of darkness, the team began their descent into the canyon. The air was hot and filled with the hum of machines. The sound made it hard to think. Every few minutes they froze as searchlights passed above them. Once a drone came so close that its shadow crossed Ethan's face, but he did not move when it was gone. He gave the signal to continue. They reached the lower tunnels of the base just before dawn and found themselves standing before a massive door made of thick steel. Ethan placed his hand on it and said softly that this was the heart of the storm. Then he turned to his soldiers and told them to be ready. No matter what happened, the world had to know that humanity did not bow to fear. The door opened with a deep groan of metal, and they entered the core chamber. It was like stepping inside a living creature. Lights moved across the walls, and energy pulsed through clear pipes that surrounded them. In the center of the room stood the control nexus, a column of blue light reaching from floor to ceiling. It hummed like a giant heartbeat. Ethan approached it slowly, his footsteps echoing through the silence. He could feel the vibration of power under his hands. When he touched the surface for a moment, he thought of all the lives lost and all the pain endured, and he whispered that this was for them. Then he pulled the detonator from his belt and began to set the charges. But before he could finish, the alarms blared. Red light filled the chamber, and mechanical soldiers began to emerge from the walls the enemy had detected. Then gunfire erupted instantly. The resistance fought back, but they were outnumbered. Ethan shouted orders, telling his men to hold the line as he finished the final connection to the explosives. One of the mechanical soldiers lunged at him, but Captain Mara shot it down before it reached him. He turned to her and shouted for her to take the others and run. She refused, saying she would not leave him, but he gave her a hard look and repeated the order. She hesitated, then saluted and began pulling the wounded back toward the tunnel. Ethan stayed behind, covering their retreat, his weapon firing in short bursts until it ran dry. Then he picked up another from the ground. His arms were shaking from exhaustion, but he kept fighting one by one. The charges clicked into place. The machines closed in there. Glowing eyes surrounding him, he looked up at the towering core and pressed the final button. The blast that followed shook the entire mountain. The ground split apart. The machines froze in place, and the light of the core shattered into a storm of sparks. Ethan was thrown backward, his body hitting the steel floor hard. Everything went silent except for the faint ringing in his ears. When he opened his eyes, the chamber was collapsing, fire and debris falling from above. He could barely move, but he saw Mara and the others standing at the edge of the tunnel shouting his name. He waved weakly, signaling them to go. Then the floor gave way beneath him, and he fell into the darkness below. The sound of the explosion faded, and the night grew. Still again above ground, the soldiers stumbled out of the canyon just as the mountain behind them began to crumble. They watched in silence as the enemy base vanished under its own weight, and the sky turned bright with the fire of victory. For the first time since the war began, there was no sound of drones, no hum of machines. Only quiet Mara stood staring at the flames. Tears on her face, she whispered that the human warship had done it. The others stood beside her, unable to speak. They all knew what his sacrifice meant. The enemy's control core was gone, their army was broken. The war was turning, and humanity had a chance again. They began to walk back toward the valley, carrying the wounded and helping each other with slow, careful steps. None of them looked back. The silence of the battlefield was the loudest sound they had ever heard. It was the silence of victory and loss mixed together, the kind that marks the end of one world and the beginning of another. The sun rose over the battlefield, but the light that touched the ruins of cities and the ashes of machines felt cold and empty. The war that had torn through the world had now reached a point where even the strongest armies had begun to lose hope. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and every breath felt heavy. The once proud nations now fought not for power but for survival. Human cities stood half destroyed, and those who once called themselves soldiers had turned into survivors. In the middle of this chaos stood the human warship Atlas, silent and still like a sleeping giant waiting for its moment to rise again. Its metal skin was torn and burned, but inside its heart still pulsed with power. The man who commanded it, Captain Elias Kane, had not slept in days. His eyes were red, but his mind was sharp, because he knew that humanity's last chance rested in his hands. The night before, he had received the message that made his heart pound. The enemy fleet was gathering for one final strike, and if they succeeded, humanity would fall. The Atlas was damaged but still alive, and he decided that even if it was broken, it would rise for one last battle. He walked through the corridors of the ship and watched his crew work with tired but steady hands. They were not just soldiers anymore, they were the last defenders of their kind. The mechanic Lyra worked on the power conduits with grease covering her face, while the pilot Rafe adjusted the targeting systems with quiet focus. No one spoke much because words were no longer needed. They all knew what was coming and what was at stake. As the morning light faded behind the smoke, the sky turned dark again. The scanners detected movement far beyond the horizon. The enemy was coming faster than expected. Thousands of enemy drones moved in perfect formation like a black cloud swallowing the sky. Each one carried weapons strong enough to pierce steel, and behind them were the capital ships that had burned countless cities. Elias stood at the command deck and gave the order to prepare all systems. The ship groaned as if it were alive and in pain, but it obeyed. The engines roared weakly at first, then grew stronger. The lights flickered, and the hum of power filled the air again. Outside, the battlefield was silent for a moment as both sides faced each other. Then the silence broke with the first explosion. The ground shook and the Atlas moved forward. Its massive guns turned and fired beams of light that cut through the air. The enemy responded with a storm of missiles. The sky turned into a blazing storm, and the sound was like thunder that never ended. Inside the ship, the crew worked without fear. Lyra shouted reports of power surges while Rafe guided the ship through the chaos, dodging fire so close it burned the armor. Elias gave his orders in a calm voice, though every decision meant life or death. Hours passed like minutes. The Atlas took hit after hit but kept fighting. The enemy tried to surround it, but Elias used every bit of his training and instinct to outmaneuver them. He knew that this battle was not just about strength, but about heart. The humans had lost much, but not their spirit. The crew of the Atlas fought not for medals or orders, but for their families, for their homes, for a future that still had a chance to exist. One by one, the enemy ships fell burning and crashing into the earth. The human forces on the ground cheered, though many of them would not live to see another sunrise. Then the enemy flagship appeared from the clouds. It was enormous, larger than any ship built by humans, and its surface glowed with dark energy. Elias knew that this was the true test. He ordered all remaining power to be directed to the main cannon. Lyra hesitated because the ship could not handle that much strain, but Elias simply said that they had no other choice. The power lines screamed, and sparks flew as the energy built up. The cannon charged and the ship shook as if it would tear itself apart. The enemy flagship fired first a beam of energy that tore through the air and struck the Atlas. The lights went out, the alarm screamed, and fire spread across the corridors. The crew fought to keep the systems alive. Elias held the control lever and with a deep breath gave the final command. The cannon fired, and the world was filled with light. The beam tore through the air like a blade of the sun itself. It struck the enemy flagship, and for a moment time seemed to stop. Then the ship exploded into 1,000 burning pieces that lit up the dark sky. The explosion was so bright that even the soldiers on the ground miles away covered their eyes. The enemy fleet froze, their formation broke, and one by one they began to retreat. Humanity had won, but the cost was heavy. Inside the Atlas, everything was quiet now. The crew looked around the burning bridge. The systems were dead, and smoke filled the air. Lyra called out to Elias, but there was no answer. She found him still, standing at the command console, his hand resting on the lever, his eyes looking at the burning sky. He had given everything for this victory. The crew stood in silence because words were too small for the moment. Outside, the battlefield was slowly becoming still. The sound of gunfire faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind. As the sun began to rise again, its light touched the broken surface of the Atlas. The people on the ground looked up and saw the great warship standing tall among the ruins. It was scarred and silent, but victorious. News of the battle spread quickly, and across the surviving cities people cried and cheered because they knew they still had a chance. The war was not over, but humanity had proven that even when all seemed lost, courage and sacrifice could bring hope again. In the weeks that followed, the survivors began to rebuild. The Atlas was too damaged to fight again, but it became a symbol. Soldiers came to see it and touch its steel hull as if it were sacred. They said that the spirit of Captain Elias Kane still watched over them and guided them. Children were told the story of the day when a single warship faced the darkness and did not fall. Scientists studied the wreck to learn how it had survived such impossible odds, and from that knowledge new ships were born. Humanity began to rise again slowly, but with purpose. The world would never forget that day when the battleground fell silent and humanity stood victorious. It was not just a victory of machines or weapons, but of human heart and will. The Atlas became more than a ship, it became a legend, a reminder that even in the darkest moment, a single spark of courage could light the way for everyone. And though the war had taken much from them, it could never take away the strength that came from unity and faith. The memory of that battle lived on, carried by those who survived and told again and again to those who came after. Because it was not just the story of a ship, it was the story of humanity itself. Years passed after the great battle that ended with the fall of the enemy flagship, and the silence that followed became the sound of peace that many had thought they would never hear again. The skies slowly cleared from the smoke of war, and the earth began to heal from the scars left behind. What remained of humanity worked hard to rebuild what was lost, and every stone placed on the ruins of old cities was a promise that life would continue. The warship Atlas still stood on the battleground where it had made its last stand, and though it was broken and quiet, people from all over the world came to see it. They called it the guardian of humanity, and even in silence, it inspired courage. The new world that grew after the war was different. Nations no longer fought for power because everyone understood what it meant to lose everything. The survivors formed a single council to lead all people together. They named it the Alliance of Earth, and its goal was not to rule but to protect and rebuild. The stories of Captain Elias Kane and his crew became part of every school lesson, and every child grew up knowing their names. They were not remembered as heroes of war, but as symbols of hope and unity. Among the people who rebuilt the new world Was Lyra the mechanic who had fought beside Elias until the very end? She had survived the battle but carried a deep silence within her. Every time she saw the sky, she remembered the flash of light that had destroyed the enemy and taken her captain. She had refused to leave the Atlas even after the war ended. Instead, she made her home near the ship and spent her days caring for what was left of it. She cleaned the metal surface when the dust covered it and kept the systems from rusting. People often asked her why she stayed, and she always said that as long as the Atlas stood, she would never leave it because it still carried the spirit of those who fought within it. One evening, as the sun began to set and the air turned golden, Lyra stood on the edge of the old battlefield. The wind moved softly over the metal of the Atlas, and she thought she heard a faint hum deep inside the ship. It had been years since the engines had last come to life, but she knew that sound well. She climbed up through the old corridors where vines had begun to grow through the cracks. The air was still, but there was a strange energy in it. When she reached the command deck, she saw the old control panel blinking weakly with a soft blue light. It was the same console where Elias had stood in his final moment. She touched the surface and felt a faint warmth. For a second, she thought she could hear his voice. The Alliance scientists had long studied the ship, but they never found a way to restore its power. They said the main reactor had burned out forever during the last blast. Yet that night something began to change. The Atlas had been built not just as a machine of war, but as a living creation connected deeply with human thought. It was designed to respond to the will of its crew, and in its heart it still carried the memory of those who had given everything. As Lyra stood there, the ship's systems began to hum again as if it had awakened from a long dream. The lights flickered and a low voice echoed through the empty halls, not in words but in sound, like a whisper of gratitude. The next morning the news spread quickly. The Atlas had come alive again. People gathered around it and watched in awe as the old warship's engines glowed faintly. It did not move and did not rise into the sky, but the soft sound that came from within it filled everyone with a strange peace. The scientists could not explain it, but many believed that it was the spirit of Captain Elias Kane watching over them. The Alliance declared that the Atlas would never be moved or repaired again, because it was now a monument, not a machine. They built a great dome around it made of glass and steel so that sunlight could always fall upon it. Inside that dome, they placed the names of every person who had fallen in the war so that no one would ever be forgotten. Years turned into decades and a new generation was born. The children who once came to see the ship with their parents now brought their own children. The world grew more beautiful and peaceful. New cities rose from the ruins, and the oceans that had turned dark with war began to shine again. The technology that once destroyed now healed. The engines that once powered weapons now powered farms and homes. Humanity had learned through suffering that power without purpose only brought sorrow. And through that lesson, they built a world where every life mattered. Still, the legend of the human warship never faded. In every corner of the earth, people told the story of how a single ship had faced the darkness, and how a crew of ordinary humans had stood against impossible odds. The old recordings of the battle were preserved and played every year on the day they called Victory Dawn. On that day, all machines were silenced for 1 minute, and people stood in quiet respect. They did not celebrate war, they celebrated courage. They remembered the moment when the battleground fell silent and humanity stood victorious not because of strength, but because of unity. Lyra grew old, but she never left the place where the Atlas stood. Her hair turned white and her hands grew weak, but her spirit stayed strong. Often she would sit near the hull and tell stories to children who came to visit. She told them about Captain Elias and his calm voice about Rafe and his fearless flying, and about the night when they all believed the world would end, but still chose to fight. The children listened with wide eyes and sometimes asked her if she was afraid back then. She would smile and say that fear was always there, but courage was stronger. When she passed away one morning in her sleep, the Alliance placed her beside the ship. They said that she too had become part of its heart. As more time passed, people began to call the place not just the Atlas Dome, but the sanctuary of humanity. It became a symbol for the entire world. Leaders from every nation came there to make peace agreements. Scientists came to study how humans had once built such strength, and artists came to find inspiration in its quiet beauty. No one saw it as a weapon anymore. It had become a reminder of what humanity could be when it stood together. One day, many years later, a young boy visited the sanctuary with his parents. He stood before the massive warship and stared at it in wonder. He asked his father if the Atlas would ever fly again. The man smiled and said that it no longer needed to, because it had already carried humanity farther than any ship ever could. The boy touched the cold metal and felt a faint vibration like a heartbeat. For a brief moment he thought he saw light move across the surface, and in his heart he felt courage rise. He did not know why, but he felt that the spirit of those who once fought still watched over the world. As the sun set and the light turned red, the Atlas stood still against the golden horizon. The wind moved softly around it, carrying the distant sound of children laughing and birds flying. The world was at peace, and though the warship would never rise again, it did not need to, because its purpose had been fulfilled. It had fought for life, and it had given hope. It had shown that even when all seemed lost, humanity could rise and stand together. And so the story of the human warship lived on, told from one generation to another as a promise that courage and unity would always guide the way, even in the darkest of times, and as long as that story was remembered, the world would never fall into silence again, because the spirit of the Atlas would always keep watch over mankind.